Hello and welcome to Edimate.tv. I'm Chetan Shan. We learn to live and live to learn in what has turned out to be an unprecedented situation, with history being written across the geography of Mother Earth. And a minor virus has created a major catastrophe, making us rethink, reboot, reformat, rewind, before we rebuild a new world, the education world. Now, one trait that's required to build this well is wisdom. Wisdom coming from past experiences, emanating from past knowledge, and the wisdom of foresight, of anticipation, of flexibility, to be able to embrace the future and evolve into the new normal. And to do that, you've got to have the people at the helm of institutions to be the wise chancellors. And today on the show, we have one of the wisest of all, Professor K.K. Agarwal, who heads the NBA. A man of exceptional foresight, a man who's been a signature in the field of education, a man who's been absolutely meritorious all throughout his career, who's been a beacon
Thank you.
in India's education system.
Thank you so much.
Tell us, sir, about Professor K.K. Agarwal. What is it that makes him so special?
You call me special, so I accept it. That's a privilege by itself. I think my journey all has been of hard work, of determination, and of a very strong feeling that I must be able to do something exceptionally good, quality in whatever I do, and that has kept me going.
Talk us through your childhood and how you came up to where you are.
I belong to a very below average income kind of family. I studied in a government or corporation's primary school, and I went to the school in the town of Amritsar where we live. It was a government school, and if you feel, I mean, my first entry to the school itself is a great education. I went to class 1 like everybody does, and on the third day, my teacher of class 1 tells me, I can't handle you for the whole year. What do I teach you? You know everything. Exceptionally good, quality in whatever I do. So let me take you to class 2. I mean, he takes me by the hand and takes me to the teacher of class 2. And he says, well, I don't think this boy has to be wasting a year. So can we take him in class 2? And the teacher of class 2 says, okay, let me try. Make him sit here, give me 3 days, and I'll come back to you. The second day, the two teachers get together and say, even 1 year for class 2 also may be too much, but at least we can try that. And both the teachers jointly go to the principal of the school, which we used to call headmaster that day, say, we believe this boy need not take 1 year in class 1. So we have decided to take it in class 2. And he says, okay, both of you agree, go ahead. And now why I am always very happy about this incident is, there is no application from me. There is no application from my father. There is no file of my giving 1 year promotion. There is no approval. Principal didn't have to send the file to Director of School Education, and I was promoted. And many a times in life I feel, as a Vice Chancellor also, I never felt that empowered, which the teacher at that time were. So with the passage of time, we have lost that empowerment, which is so necessary in academic world. And in lighter vein, many a time when I recollect that I became youngest professor in the world at the age of 27, if those teachers would not have been there, it would have been 28.
You had an exceptional career. We were first almost all throughout. Talk us through that part.
Chetan, after that I did pre-engineering, we used to call it that day, which was class 12. I stood first in the university and beaten all previous records. That time it was Punjab University, which was the only university in the states of Punjab, Haryana, Himachal, Chandigarh at that time. Then I studied for my BTech in Punjab Engineering College, Chandigarh. And there again, I stood first in the university, beating all previous records. And somehow during those years of engineering, I did start to believe that instead of doing an engineering job on the ground, I'll be better into profession of teaching engineering students. And somehow I could succeed in getting my ambitious career and got it. And second thing I decided at that time is whatever I achieve, I will achieve from the land of India. I will not go to study abroad, I will go to lecture abroad. I will write in India, publish abroad. So I wrote a book from India, got it published from America. I wrote papers all from India, published 150 of them abroad. I went to about 25 universities all over the world to deliver lectures, not to study. So the point is, I thought India is a land which can enable us to do everything, and I have to prove it on the ground.
The problem of being so exceptionally bright and being first all throughout, at the top of your game all throughout, is that how do you continue to motivate yourself?
First of all, I do believe to some extent it's God's blessings, which is always there. But second motivation is my family, even extended family, parental side, maternal side, nobody had really gone to school also. So there was no formal guidance. But somehow my parents were very strong that education is a great value and they should allow their children to be educated. And when I stood first in the university in class 12, I think that was the start of motivation. You believe, yes, you can do it. And as they say, success, your own success is your best motivator. So I think that happened in my case. And thereafter, God kept on giving me successes and they kept on motivating me. By God's grace, I could keep myself on track, on rails, and kept on achieving to a level where I'm being able to talk to a senior person like Chetan.
That's so sweet of you. Your crowning glory has to be being the founder vice chairman of the Indraprastha University, and that could not have been easy. Talk us through the challenges, talk us through that experience.
Indraprastha University was a very great project for me, and when it was offered to me, it was a bit of a challenge to begin with, but the university was born. A very challenging issue at that time, which motivated me in person, was I felt little bad. The town of Delhi, which was the seat of power, or not only of the government of Delhi, but the entire central government, we did not establish an engineering college for 25 years. We did not establish a medical college for 35 years, and with such a good school system. So many a times I used to talk to families and all that the bright children had very less opportunities in the town of Delhi.
Yeah.
And the second thing in this process was, I think girls were suffering like anything, because in our traditional system, still people were reluctant to send girls outside. So girls were practically not getting a professional education at all. And so I thought this is an opportunity which God is providing me to kill several objectives in one go, and I accepted this challenge.
You currently head the MBA.
Yeah.
Now, not too many people are aware of the education system of this country. So just give us a brief of the MBA. What does it do? And what has been your contribution to it?
This country has at the moment two accreditation bodies. One is NAC and another is NBA. NAC is for the total system of the junior higher education. NBA is only for technical programs. So we consider accreditation of only engineering, architecture, management, pharmacy programs, nothing else. Number one. Number two, we consider in tune with the international standards, accreditation of the departments or the programs, not of the institutions. Because like all good universities abroad, we do find some institution may have an excellent mechanical engineering, but not so good electrical engineering. So therefore, we do not accredit a college as such or a university as such, but we accredit program-wise. You are accredited for mechanical engineering, or you are accredited for civil engineering, so on and so forth. So that is one difference. Third important difference is we are a member of what we call as Washington Accord. Washington Accord is a consortium of 20 countries accreditation bodies, which includes USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Canada, etc., etc. And these 20 countries have decided to evolve a uniform method of accreditation. So the purpose is, if you are graduate from an engineering college which is accredited by any of these 20 countries agencies, you are fit for placement in any of these 20 countries. So that's the great thing for international mobility. The whole philosophy was international mobility at lesser hassles when you go abroad. So that is how Washington Accord enables National Board of Accreditation to acquire a status of its own. We follow the international standards, international methodology. We are a little tough in evaluation, but I believe because this is accreditation, this is not approval. So it's good to be maintaining standards. And at the moment in the country, we have just about 15% programs accredited. So we are encouraging more and more people. At the moment, the government has issued guidelines that by 2022, at least 50% programs should be accredited. It's a purpose to encourage them to improve in the quality. So that's how we go about it.
Well, obviously this requires high integrity, but also it requires a lot of flexibility, and I'll tell you why. Because the sense of dynamism now, not just in the education system in India and across the world, now with the post-COVID environment, it's even going to get more dynamic, which means there are going to be no new career options, which also means teaching us to be, interdisciplinary. So how flexible, how updated are you? And how much are you giving cognizance to India's external employability when India itself requires employability within itself?
First is employability, second is employment. Employability-wise, today in engineering, whether it's external employability or internal employability, there is very little difference because technology is the same and method of working is the same. So therefore, employability is almost the same. Employment is a different question. Second is, as far as these graduate attributes are concerned, which I mentioned, they are very much more or less subject independent, because we say engineers should be able to solve complex problems. An engineer should have a sound knowledge of science. Engineer should be able to demonstrate good ethics, and so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of attributes which we have defined, which are not so heavily dependent upon thermodynamics or algorithmic design and so on and so forth. So therefore, flexibility in terms of change of knowledge is built in. That's not an issue. And I agree with you that the rate of change at this point in the history of civilization is the highest ever. Highest ever. It has never happened again. And with this rate of change, our education system has to change very fast. And frankly telling you, I'm not very satisfied with the rate of change. We have to change faster. All sorts of combinations are there in the world. We have to adopt it. I came across a student abroad. I said, what are you studying? He says, sir, I am studying medical science and economics. As a professor from India, I just cannot imagine how can you study medical science and economics formally together. It's impossible in India as of now, at least. So why I'm trying to tell you is we have to give opportunities to these types of young thinkers and students who can plan for themselves. A beautiful side of COVID, which is a very negative thing otherwise, is that we have now accepting some flexibility. I always say that our graduates now, not only engineers, everybody will have to have what they call is T-shaped personality. And from T-shaped personality, I mean you will have to have depth of knowledge in a subject, but breadth of knowledge in several subjects. Unless you do not have breadth of knowledge in several subjects, only depth of knowledge in some subject may not make you a problem solver.
Well, you pointed out, of course, about one opportunity which COVID has thrown up. But there have been several downsides, several challenges. Talk us through the challenges that you think are the most poignant and the most difficult to overcome and the possible solutions. And why I say this is, and particularly for you, because, you know, you have shown through your experience, particularly, you know, with the Indraprastha University, how to make it self-reliant. And here is the Prime Minister who talks about making a self-reliant country. So what is required to make the Indian education system self-reliant post-COVID?
We believe and hope that this Prime Minister will be able to give thrust to these education areas also. For example, number one, instead of doing compartmentalization in education, we should rather go to removing the boundaries. For example, I even believe knowledge and skills to be treated separately may not be very good today, because these skills are not uneducated skills of today. Today, when I say 3D printing is a skill, then he must have the knowledge of something. My takes and suggestions, which I have formally given also, let us integrate skill courses in these courses itself. And some of the combinations can be very, very unique. For example, in BSc, to a physics student, if I give a course on TV repair, a person with a background of physics, if he becomes a TV repair mechanic, he'll be a wonderful mechanic, because today's TV is not what it used to be. So somebody ought to understand it. So this is one combination. Then another combination I have suggested, a tourist guide. If he has formally studied history, geography, and third skill subject as tourist guide. Now, a tourist guide who has formally studied the formal subject of history and geography, I don't think we can produce a better tourist guide in the country than with this. So my take is we have come to a point where skills and knowledge must be combined. Boundaries should be killed. So the point is, something gets birthed somewhere, is to be used by somewhere else. That encouragement has to be done. That culture has to be encouraged, and that can be done only when we remove the boundaries. And
Right.
that is why a beautiful recommendation in the new policy of education, which is yet to be announced. So I don't think I'm doing a serious mistake if I reveal that. One of the strong recommendations is, from now on, we will not establish single discipline institutions.
Absolutely.
We will go to multidisciplinary
Multidisciplinary,
institutions. And I think that's a great recommendation.
This, sir, is the era of lateral thinking. And, you know, you've just spoken so eloquently about the theory, not just of disruption, but more important, the theory of discovery. And, you know, that is what is going to enhance the power of learning, not so much of educating, but you need to learn. And when you become a learner, you know, you have to keep an open mind. So thank you for, you know, for encouraging us to do that. Professor Agarwal, you spoke about how you turned around, or in fact, you made the Indraprastha University completely self-sufficient financially. Now, you know, several universities these days are fledgling in terms of finances. What has been the mantra? What would be your advice to them?
85% of the graduates in higher education system are in state universities, and they are very poorly funded. Many of them very poor standard. And I always say, a few lighthouses in the country will give me some satisfaction of the quality of higher education, but really it doesn't turn around the country. We have excellent IITs. We have aims of the highest quality. We have some central universities which are better than the best in the world, but the number is only very, very few. So unless we are able to improve the general quality of education, which is, I'm sorry to say, is pathetic, to say the least. So funding is one issue. Administration of the university is another issue. And secondly, this concept which we had of very low fees and all that. So either we should say, yes, education is the responsibility of the state and we do taxation whatever we wish to, but we will allow everybody to get quality education. That's one method. Second is the ones who can pay were also not asked to pay for several years. For example, I know we made a study in IIT system. All through we admitted students at a fee of 50 rupees a month or 60 rupees a month, and 95% plus of them belong to very affluent families. So the point is, education should not be deprived to anybody, but those who can pay may be asked to pay without any problem. But we have to, or state funding, but unless we take care of these 85% habitats universities, we will not be able to improve the average quality, and unless the average quality improves, I don't think we get much out of it. Yes, some lighthouses give us some satisfaction. I'm very happy that IITs are recognized world over and with a great degree of recognition and respect. But again, I say, out of 5,000 engineering colleges, why I am able to accredit only 15%? Why not at least 50%? Why not at least 60%? So that is the direction in which we have to move, because I have been very strongly believing higher education without quality may be a negative asset.
I started out this conversation saying that we live in an unprecedented pandemic these days. And that's thrown open, several challenges and a lot of fear and panic amongst almost everybody related to the education ecosphere. The student, the parent, the teacher, professor, and even the vice chancellor. I'd like you, with your rich experience, your meritocratic background, and your excellence, in whatever field that you've led.
Thank you.
To advise each of these factions.
Well, I have two issues on this. One is this kind of disruption, which is once in a century kind of thing. It's a very bad disruption. It has disrupted the whole world. 1.6 billion students are outside the classrooms in the world. In India alone, 33 plus crore students, not higher education, but total school, college, are outside the classrooms. So they had to be taken care of. And we were really never prepared for online education to that extent. So if I look to the firefighting measure, we have done reasonably good. At least most of our teachers are trying to deliver some kind of knowledge to the students, some in very good way, some in not that good way, but it's going on. Similarly, students are receiving it, and whatever feedback I get, it's not bad. I won't say it's very good, but it's not bad. So, but that's a firefighting measure. That does not mean this can become a norm. So the norm will be when we start reopening. When we start reopening, the social distance and all that will have to remain. Therefore, I do not see in a foreseeable future that our institutions will start functioning the way they used to function in February. Because I'll not be able to put 60, 70, 80 students in a class, 30 students in a laboratory, at least for a year. And therefore, wherever I got a chance to talk to the academic world, I said, you all be prepared for a blended mode of education. You will have to learn to do something online, something in the classroom. Education, I feel, will become flexible not only at the level of the university, but at the level of the college, at the level of the teacher. We'll have to empower the teacher to decide, well, this I can cover online. For this, I'll have to have students in the class. It will be his decision. I can't decide it. Student will have to be empowered. Sir, I don't have broadband in my village. Therefore, I will like to attend complete course face-to-face. And you will have to arrange for it. So the facility and the flexibility will have to be there at every level. It will have to be very flexible system which will come in, and we should like to make the best of it. As far as quality systems are concerned, we are still not very thorough with quality systems of online education because it came to us all of a sudden. We'll have to develop that. I always say when my computer gets virus, I reformat it. Similarly, COVID as a virus has given me an opportunity to reformat our higher education system.
Right.
Because to remove the virus, best is to reformat. This system of examination which you faced, I faced, everybody faced, that at the end of the session, every child in every subject will have to write a 3-hour theory exam. I could not find any literature where 3 hours is sacrosanct. Why not 2 hours? Why not 4 hours? Why not this?
Absolutely.
Why can't it change from subject to subject? Some subjects may not justifiably be done by theory examination. They may be justified only by a talk between you and me.
True.
Was best examination may be that. Sometimes best examination may be asking you to do some job, and so on and so forth. So the point is, examination can vary from subject to subject, and incidentally, I did back of the envelope calculations. This 3-hour examination philosophy with the answer books and all that costs us more than 6 crore trees every year only to prepare answer books for this. So if I reformat the system and assume I am able to reduce this 3 hours to 2 hours, I save 2 crore trees a year. Let us not go back to what we were.
Right.
Number one. Number two, let us not be too cozy with what we are doing as a firefighting nation.
Right.
We will have to find a solution in between, and I personally believe this is an opportunity for me to get rid of all the trash in my system.
Because we started out by saying that this pandemic is forcing us to reboot, rethink, rewind, and rebuild, and you just said that to reformat. It's also interesting that how you drew a parallel between the 3-hour examination and trees. And you talked about interdisciplinary, you talked about physics and philosophy. Here, in this, you require management and ecology to be able to think laterally. So it's just how beautifully you've actually exemplified, in your experiences as to what has to be the future. And, that's perhaps the reason that we say that wisdom is important. And that's why we have this need for a wise chancellor. And
so nice of you to brand it like this.
And if there ever was a wise chancellor, it must be Professor K.K. Agarwal, one of India's brightest minds. And thank you, sir, for inspiring us, giving us the opportunity to learn from you, and for being our wise chancellor.
I'm so happy that you took this initiative. In the lighter vein, I have always been saying our media space is either for film actors or for criminals or for cricketers. It's probably very rarely we have space for intellectuals, for academicians. I think it's a very great initiative on your part to be able to talk to some people from academic world and take their experiences. Each one of them is a rich experience.